Please welcome your panelists for Educate, Elevate, Empower, Investing in Girls and Women, moderated by Executive Director of Business and Program Development at the Milken Institute, Katie O'Reilly.
That's me. Hi. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us. We have a great panel discussion set up today. I want to take a minute just to frame the conversation. For those of you that have been attending the global conference over the years, we've had many of these types of discussions, and more you're seeing it, I hope, included in the regular content. This year we have a very focused diversity track. Some of you may have attended some of the sessions we had today. This session is meant to be, it does say investing in women and girls, and what we mean we mean investing in a broad sense. So we're going to be talking about financial investment, but investment of passion, time, resources, all of that. You know, we're having this conversation at a time where I think I was just in this room an hour ago where we had the Me Too panel. So I want to acknowledge that that's the context that we're having this discussion in, and we will be talking about it, but we also want to not be overly focused on the political leanings of the day. So I would just say, to start off, at this moment in time, there are many positive trends in the world in this way. We've seen a lot of research shows that education gaps are closing pretty much in every major country between women and men. Many growth industries now are favoring women, sectors like healthcare. There are more women attending universities than men, at least in the countries that are reporting that information. At the same time, we all know there are challenges, which is why we're here. There's still there are as many Fortune 500 CEOs named John as there are women CEOs, which was in the New York Times last week. For every child, women's earnings decreased by 4%, while men's earnings increased by 6%. A recent study predicted, and I think this is in some of the leaderboards outside, if current trends continued, humankind is expected to reach Mars 50 years before we achieve gender pay equality in the workforce. So we have some challenges, and that's what we're going to jump into here with this panel. The other thing I want to say is that I've moderated a number of these sessions over the last few years, and oftentimes people come up to me afterwards, and I shared this with the panel, and I want this sort of as the framework to kind of push us to really have the tough conversation. People will come up to me after the session and say, you know, it's so great that the Institute is focusing on these issues, and I was so happy to hear all the panelists talking about their ideas. But why are we still talking about these issues, about women advancing? And so I just want to throw that out now and know that we've been thinking about that, and we will have Q&A. We're going to open it up probably for 10 to 15 minutes at the end. So if there are questions about that or anything else, you can feel free to jump in. So I'm going to go ahead and just briefly introduce the panelists. All the way to my right is Nancy Armstrong, who's executive producer and founding member of Makers. Makers is a feminist media brand and online platform which features original videos, podcasts, and interviews, all sort of focusing on this women's stories and the narrative of women. Brian O'Neill, who's directly to my right, is chief investment officer of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is the nation's largest public health philanthropy with over $11 billion in assets under management. To my left is Shiza Shahid, who is the founder of Now Ventures, a fund investing in mission-driven startups, particularly those led by women. And many of you probably know her also as the co-founder of the Malala Fund, focused on education and a speaker on social innovation. And then next to Shiza is John Wood, who is the founder of Room to Read, a leading nonprofit focused on girls' education and children's literacy in Asia and Africa. And then last, but certainly not least, is Shelley Zalis, who's the founder of the Girls Lounge and CEO of the Female Quotient, which is a business focused on advancing equality in the workplace. So Shelley, I'm going to turn to you to start us off. You've been in the equality business, if we can call it that, for a long time. Tell us a bit about the Female Quotient and what sort of the focus is. But I want you to address this issue of progress in the movement in terms of why we're still having this conversation, how you feel we're doing today.
No, I would love to. I call myself now, I'm in the business of equality because I think we have to talk about it as a business. If we just talk about it as a nice to have, we are going to make no progress. So gender equality is certainly not a nice to have. It is a business imperative. And we say that diversity is good for business, and yet we are going backwards. So here we are at a global conference. When you measure 144 countries on gender equality, the United States 2 years ago, out of 144 was number 28. Last year, it was number 45. We've gone backwards, not forwards. Rwanda, number 6. Iceland, number 1. Imagine. And so it's a conscious decision. Rwanda made a conscious decision to put women in government and forced that issue. So, you know, I say when you put women in any equation, the equation gets better. But what do we need? You brought up Me Too movement. It's been amazing to break the silence. Great. It's been terrific to start creating consequences for bad behavior. Amazing. But where do we go from here? We need to create solutions for change. We need to create next step solutions. It's not that complicated on closing the wage gap, on creating more sponsorship opportunities to elevate women past the messy middle management. We need to work on culture and policy and leadership to be more conscious of what we're doing. Mm-hmm. We can be better if we choose to be better. And so I think that when we talk about this, it's creating solutions, but it's also creating accountability for change. No accountability, we can just continue to say we are doing something and we're not measuring our progress as a result.
Right. And so actually maybe Nancy, that's a good segue to you, because you can't have accountability unless you're telling the stories, right? And you're providing that platform. So can you, I mean, I introduced Makers a little bit, but maybe talk about why you felt that was so important to focus on, was the ability of women to tell their own stories.
Right, well, it resonated with me. It was back in 2010. I went to a cocktail party in New York, and there was this little project called the Women's 2.0 Media Project that was trying to get off the ground and had been trying to get off the ground since 2004. So 6 years, and no one would touch it with a 10-foot pole because no one was really interested in women's stories and women's history and the advancement of women at that point. There had been, you know, from the revolution in the early 70s, you know, was sort of the foundation for change. The 80s and 90s were a little bit of a quiet period where feminism felt like it was very much frozen, but women were making gains behind the scenes. And then, you know, as we got to 2010 was when I found the project, and it resonated with me because I know that I grew up in a relative vacuum of female role models. And I know that that was an inhibitor to my being out in the world, to being able to envision a path for myself that led to leadership. It didn't seem like there would be any path that could lead to leadership, but there were just no role models. So I went to this cocktail party, and Gloria Steinem was there, and a filmmaker, Dylan McGee, was there, and I had this epiphanic moment that the stories had to be told. We needed to tell these stories to inspire and ignite the next generation of female leaders, because I didn't have them, and it was very difficult. So we set about the task of interviewing the top 100 groundbreaking women in America. We did a 3-part documentary telling the story for the first time, which was stunning to me. The story of the women's movement had never been told, and neither had any of the stories of these women. So they were all hidden figures. So it was 100 hidden figures. Now on Makers, we have about 400 hidden figures. And then, you know, we branched out beyond that and started to get involved more in this mission of gender equality in the workplace and gender equality in leadership.
Great. So let's, I want to go back kind of to the beginning of this continuum, because I know we're talking a lot about professional women, but education is a big piece of this. And so John, maybe you could talk about, because I know as we're sitting here talking about getting women into the C-suite and, you know, mentoring in professional careers, there are plenty of people, and primarily girls around the world, who don't even really have basic literacy. And so can you tell us a little bit about that and what Room to Read is doing to address it?
Yeah, definitely. So our focus is on, so I live in Hong Kong, which is a city with very, very high buildings. What every high building needs is a deep foundation. And I believe that education is the best foundation. Probably every one of us in this room probably have an educated mother, educated father. Throughout the developing world, and I cut my teeth in my business career at Microsoft for nearly a decade, and I spent a lot of time in the developing world looking at it from an investment perspective as a technology company. But what I continually noticed is how many kids, especially young girls in the developing world, have lost the lottery of life. We all know that the two most important factors in what our life is like as a young person are where we are born and to whom we are born. And if you're born to a wealthy family in Zurich or Greenwich, Connecticut, or wherever it might be, it doesn't mean your life's going to be perfect, but you have those two baseline things that are there. So many young women in the developing world today have lost the lottery of life. They're born in the wrong place at the wrong time. It can be rural Bangladesh. It can be Tanzania, where 4 out of 5 girls in rural areas don't make it past grade 5. And the statistics are fairly alarming, but don't worry, I'm not a glass half empty kind of guy. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. I think we can solve the problem. But the statistics are pretty amazing. There's 770 million people in the world today who are illiterate. 2/3 of them are girls and women. So you're talking about an addressable change that can affect 450 plus million girls and young women if you get it right. And over 100 million girls and young women in the developing world this morning woke up and didn't go to school. Over 100 million. So think about that for a second. How can you solve that? So I'm proud to say that I am a feminist. I grew up with an educated mother, an educated older sister who became a school librarian, and an educated grandmother, all of whom read to me. So I am the product of 3 strong educated women. So my goal basically is to say every single girl, along with every single boy, because we talked in our panel about making this inclusive. It shouldn't be either or, it should be both. But our goal at Room to Read is to make sure that every young girl and every young boy, whether they be in rural South Africa or rural Bangladesh or in post-Civil War Sri Lanka or post-Khmer Rouge Cambodia, have a chance to go to school. And if I get time to come back to it, I would love to also give you the statistics, because I believe very much what you were saying, what gets measured gets done. And coming from a private sector background, we're all about measurement. So if I can come back to that at some point, I'd love to.
Yeah, of course.
Katie, I just want to say one thing. We added the word men to feminism because of you, John. So we spell it F-E-M-E-N-I-S-M. Modern feminism must include men. We're all in this together. So it is an inclusive conversation and not just women supporting women. We all need to do this together. Yeah. So kudos to you.
And I think part of it is being able to demonstrate what everybody has to gain from this, right? It's not just, I mean, of course, it's feminism, but the way that the systems are sometimes designed means that men also lose from the traditional structures, right? So
yeah, half of all children born to an educated mother are going to be boys. So to me, it's not a men versus women issue. It's a let's just roll up our sleeves, be all in this together, and have what I call a GSD attitude, which is get shit done. Let's not sit around and make excuses. Let's get out in the field and make it happen and get millions of these kids in school every day.
Yeah, okay. So Shiza, I want to just lastly go to you in terms of these introductory kind of statements. I know you know a lot about the developing world. You grew up in Pakistan. Mm-hmm. Your career is bigger than I know what you've been doing with the Malala Fund, but I think what we know about Malala Yousafzai, if I'm saying it correctly, and what happened to her, I think a lot of people, and I think most people in the room know, but if you could tell that story, I mean, I think a lot of people in the US, while we're talking about, access to higher education and C-suite jobs, might have a tough time understanding what a young girl in the developing world is going through and why a 15-year-old girl who wants to be educated could be so threatening.
Yeah, it's a big question, so I'll try and weave it in and keep it as brief as I can. So I was born in the second worst country for women. I was born to a mother who never had a chance to be anything other than a wife and a mother. She was told at a very young age that she would not get to pursue higher education or build a career. She was born into a very traditional patriarchal Pakistani family. And she made the radical choice that no matter the cost, her daughters would have the opportunities that she didn't. So I was fortunate to grow up in a loving home and have a good education, and eventually to get a scholarship to Stanford and to be able to explore my own dreams. And I tried to pay that forward by investing in other women and girls in Pakistan who didn't have that same access. One of those girls was Malala, who I got to know when she was 11. She came to a summer camp that I created secretly while I was a sophomore at Stanford. And my goal was to have the stories of the schoolgirls from her hometown, the Swat Valley, a remote part of Pakistan that was threatened by the Taliban, where girls' education had been banned, to have the stories of these schoolgirls reach the world, kind of like Anne Frank's diary, so that people knew what was happening in that region from the perspective of the schoolgirl. And that really, one thing led to another, and her and her father and I started the Malala Fund that now invests in girls' education. But really growing up in Pakistan, I was witnessing the lack of role models in entrepreneurship, in business. And when I came to Stanford, it was the first time I was exposed to entrepreneurship and to technology and the pace of change where, we live in a time and place today where a girl born in Pakistan with a smartphone and access to the internet has more information than a US president did 15 years ago. And I thought to myself, how do we apply technology and entrepreneurship to solve the world's greatest challenges? And while many incredible things are coming out of the entrepreneurial ecosystems like Silicon Valley, 3% of venture capital is going to women, 0.2% to Black women. And so that really inspired me to then start Now Ventures, which invests in women entrepreneurs and diverse entrepreneurs and mission-driven entrepreneurs who are operating at the intersection of business, entrepreneurship, and social good.
Great. So we're going to come back to a number of points you've both made, because this conversation we want to be very solutions-oriented, and we want each of you to walk away with some ideas about how you can actually bring this forward and have some impact. And I want to turn to Brian lastly. We were really excited to have Brian participate, I think, for a number of reasons, but also because the Milken Conference, I think, is known as it's the largest gathering of capital markets in the world. So the people here speak the business of finance, and that's who a lot of the people are in the room. So I think another thing I'd say I hear off to the side after moderating these sessions is this is so great. It's we're passionate about these issues, but I don't really see what it has to do with me and my bottom line and what I'm trying to return for my investors. So I know you have a more nuanced view. Maybe you could just talk a bit about how you came to see this issue.
Right. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has been in existence for 46 years. And over that time, some of the most important things we've done are what we call the leadership development programs. We provided scholarships for promising researchers, medical school students, nursing students, and almost every level of the healthcare workforce, partly to identify particularly promising individuals and partly to diversify the healthcare workforce. And over the course of 40 years, we've touched a lot of lives and have really made a lot of changes there. So 6 years ago, we had our 40th anniversary, and we talked about all of these programs at once for the first time, and the light bulb went off for me. I said, we could do that in investments. We can invest in human capital in the investment field. So we're focusing on two moments in careers. One being the entry. How do people decide they want to go into investments, or maybe a little bit more broadly, finance? And then secondly, at a point in mid-career when they decide to take a risk, start their own business, do something that is going to take them outside of their comfort zone and really could use some support. So on the first, we have teamed up with an organization that many of you from New York have heard of called SEO. They're probably the largest supplier of women and minority candidates for Wall Street analyst jobs. And every year they place 100 individuals into summer jobs at Wall Street firms, and every year 75% of those individuals get hired full-time and get the Wall Street analyst job. And SEO does other things, but I think that's the part of it that we were really interested in. We have an intern program. We work with them. We got to know them. Said this organization is fantastic. So last year, the foundation made a significant grant to SEO so that they can touch more lives, send more people into their entry-level jobs, and also improve their alumni network. So that's the entry level. And then it's sort of mid-career, we have an emerging manager program. And the point of the emerging manager program is to find promising, relatively new investment organizations, typically but not exclusively run by women or minorities, and to invest in them at a point when that can really make a difference. We've had that program for 5 years, and I think it's done a lot for the funds that we've invested with.
And then how do you think about the business case for some of these investments? Like as you're building your team, as you're thinking about boards of advisors or people weighing in on decisions about investing, I mean, do you see a benefit in diversity in that room?
Well, the first business case would be, we typically want to have a stream of new investment organizations to invest with. We have a good lineup of managers, but there's usually a need to identify some new ones. And if you can find someone who is talented and is going to be successful early, you can have a long-term relationship, be important to that individual or that organization, and have what you might call a beautiful friendship.
Right.
So we would really like to do that. More broadly, I think that we, as a foundation, are dependent on our investment return to fuel our grant making. So we'd like to get the best investment return we can, and we do that through the financial markets. If the financial markets have a more diverse set of decision makers, they'll do a better job, and we will benefit indirectly from that as well.
Right. So there's been, so much research, I think, that points to that. A number of the big banks have published paper after paper saying that. So you would, on one hand, think it would be easier, and we would be seeing more and more women, or at least more diverse teams, more diverse leadership teams. And Nancy, I want to come to you because you wrote a piece in our Power of Ideas, and one of the things you talked about was unconscious bias, which I think can be, maybe you could just talk a bit about that term and how you see it playing out, because I think it's sort of an insidious thing to work against.
It is. Well, just going back to the research, one of the reasons that, to answer the original question that we keep talking about this year after year, is because we're just talking amongst ourselves. It's a lot of women really talking amongst ourselves, and until we bring men in to talk about it and start seeing it as a bottom line issue, which it is. All the studies, as Katie mentioned, universities, the banks, McKinsey, and they've been doing their studies for over 10 years, but all of them point to the fact that when you have female directors on teams, they outperform teams without female directors in price to book value multiples and average growth, in ROI. So that the case has been made for the business, the economic sustainability case. And the good news is 78% of CEOs say, or companies say that gender parity is a top priority for the CEO and therefore the company. Where they struggle is how to execute on that. And what's happening is very interesting to see where it happens. In 2017, 46% of women went into the entry level, so it was about half. By the first promotion, which is the managerial level, it was down to 37%. So somehow we've lost 9% right there, and there's no reason why that should be happening, but that's happening. There's no rational reason that should be happening, I should say. Then by the time you get to senior director, it's gone down another 4%, and by the time you get to the C-suite level, we're down to 20%. And what they've looked at is that women after the entry level are 18% less likely to be promoted to the manager level. And if we were to promote from the entry level to the manager level in equal numbers, we would more than double the current number of women in C-suite roles and in the CEO roles, which are very low. It's 5% now. It was actually 32. We went back down to 28. And as you said, it's this unconscious bias, which exists in all companies. It permeates our culture. There was a study by Simpian and Leslie that said by age 6, little girls identify men as being smarter than women. So it's happening.
So women have the unconscious bias as well.
Well, it's in the water. It's akin to something being in the water. So boys are learning it and girls are learning it. So by the time they get to the workplace, what they're calling it is second generation bias. So it's not really a deliberate attempt not to promote women, not to sponsor women, but it's more of a cultural context that keeps women from rising to their full potential. They don't get as much constructive critical feedback as men do. They get more vague feedback. With the interview process being every year, we're not focusing on differing leadership styles. Women tend to be more collaborative, cooperative, participatory, less hierarchical than men. That's not true in all cases, just generally. And we need to remove this unconscious bias. So how do we do that? Well, some companies are separating men and women. So they'll review all the women together against a set of transparent criteria. All the women that are eligible move up, and then they review all the men separately against a transparent set of criteria, not against the person currently sitting in the seat that they're aspiring to, which is probably male. So right there's a bias if you're comparing a female going into that position to the male who already holds that position. And then if you have to promote fewer men in that scenario, then you promote fewer men. You know, that's kind of a radical thing to say. It sounds unfair, but I would argue that it's been unfair for decades. So the only way for us to push past this, as Shelley said, 100 years to get to gender parity in the C-suite is to really have bold action, to walk the walk, to build trust. You know, 175 CEOs signed a pledge that said they will get to gender parity by 2020, 50-50 by 2020. And that's not just a pledge you can make and then walk away and hope it all works out. You have to build action into your company with intention. One of the things that Oath is doing, Oath is the combination of AOL and Yahoo. They came together in 2017. And since then, 86% of their hires, VP and above, are women. The CEO of Oath, who I know very well, insists that it has mandated that you have to have women in every meeting. So if he walks into a room and there are no women in the meeting, he shuts it down. And they say, well, what do you know? You can't shut down the meeting. And he says, well, where are the women? So they're running around getting junior women to come into the management meeting, just filling the room with women, which is great because junior women get exposure to a business management meeting and what goes on there and how decisions are made. And business managers are getting exposure to junior talent to see what their skills are, what their perspectives are. He brought in someone from another team. Susan Line does Built by Girls at Oath, and he said that was the most valuable input in the whole meeting. So you have to have real intention about it or it's not going to happen. And otherwise, we'll be sitting here again next year talking about why hasn't it happened yet. Right. I mean, I just spoke to someone at a dinner last night who said, yeah, you know, we'd love to have more women in our leadership team, but it hasn't happened yet. I don't know what's wrong. You know.
But I was at that conversation, yeah. And that's the kind of conversation you hear not on the panel. And I was watching your expression in because it's
let me help you.
Yeah, but so let's push back on that for a second though, because I think I'm thinking of the 30% Club, which I don't know if many of you know Helena Morrissey, who's based in the UK. So she runs Newton Investment Management. But she's also well known for founding something called the 30% Club, which essentially did what Nancy is saying, that set quotas for boards. So, and she had very powerful people like Michael Corbat at Citi and Michael Bloomberg sign on that this was the right way to run companies, and they sort of made a pledge that they would do this. 30% of their boards would have female representation. So, but I think, and that's something you can talk about on a panel and say it's a great idea, but then you get to talk to business leaders and they say, well, I'm not going to run my company that way. I mean, so Shelley, what would you say to that?
First of all, can I be a little controversial?
Oh, go for it.
There's no such thing as unconscious bias. It's conscious. I mean, let's just get to it. This is just not so complicated. Women are paid 79 cents on the dollar. So I sell candy for $1 to men and 79 cents to women, just to sensationalize this issue. It's a legacy issue. Women historically have not been in the workplace. These rules were written over 100 years ago by men for men because women were not in the workplace. Now, women are paid based on past performance. How much did you make at your last job? I'm going to pay you a little bit more. Men are paid on potential. Now we're creating new legislation that is prohibiting people to ask what you got paid so that we could equalize.
And actually in California, that's current.
Exactly. So let's just talk about the wage gap. Why is there a wage gap? Mark Benioff decided, CEO of Salesforce, he's going to push the damn button. You said the S word, so I could say the D word, right? Right? Okay, he's going to push the button, figure out where the inequity is, fix it. Ouch, it cost him $3 million, but he fixed it. And moving forward, equal pay for equal work. Done. Not complicated. Pledges do not work. You make a commitment and you think That is your, do good effort. Pledges don't work. It's actions that speak way louder than words. Look at hiring. What's the problem? We say we've got a fat and happy pipeline 50-50, but then the hiring manager is a white or Asian man. You end up with someone that quote unquote looks like you. You don't hire people that look like you. You hire people that act like you. That's really what happens. So if you truly want diversity in your workplace, have diversity in the hiring side of the business. It's not complicated. It's just an action that has to happen with accountability. You got to hold people accountable. And you look at the unconscious. Katie, you're pregnant, right?
I am.
Okay, so let's have that conversation.
Not just
you have, so is it unconscious or conscious? You have a man, you have a woman, equally qualified. One's pregnant, one's not. Is it unconscious? Well, I don't know. Let me think about it. You're going to go on maternity leave, take 3 months off. I can't replace you because I'm not allowed. So I have an empty position. You're not going to be able to travel, a lot. You're not going to be able to work long hours. Is that unconscious? No, I don't think so. It's conscious. So we need to create new policy. It's not just about mandatory or, maternity leave, which is lovely. Elective paternity leave, men don't take it because it shows a sign of weakness. And if they do, Harvard Business Review, they play more golf. Just saying. So we need mandatory parental leave. Like mandatory parental leave. Man or woman, if you have a child, you both take time off. At least that could equalize. So we just need new policies for today's modern society. And it's not that complicated.
But what about the pieces that are, and I'm sure there's more discussion we could have about that, but what about the pieces that are not as concrete like that? Like when Nancy talks about mentorship, one of, I don't want to say backlash, but one of the fears I think that's been discussed, I don't know how openly, but in reaction to the Me Too movement has been, on the one hand, praise, this is great, it's gotten all these issues out here that people felt they had to be secretive about before. On the other hand, again and again, men are being told, you're doing this wrong, don't move that way, move this way. So I guess maybe to the men on the panel, and this is one of the things I hear from more senior men who I guess I know better that maybe wouldn't say it so publicly, but, and I can say in my own career, a lot of the mentorship I had was from senior men because those were the people that had those positions. And so if you're not able to create these informal types of relationships with your superiors, and yeah, John, do you want?
Can I just throw something? I would say that I think if there's any man out there who feels like in the aftermath of Me Too, he has to radically change his behavior about having mentoring meetings or dinners or whatever else, he needs to look himself in the mirror and ask why. I haven't changed anything that I've done. Because, thank you for the 6 of you who applauded. But I mean, to you asked to be a little bit controversial, I'll say, I've not, in the aftermath of the Me Too movement, I've not changed anything I've done. If there is somebody on my staff and I want to invite her to go to lunch to celebrate a victory or go to dinner to celebrate a victory, there was nothing I was doing wrong in the first place, so why should I have to change my behavior? So I think any man who says, well, gosh, it's almost like Me Too is like somehow inhibiting me from doing mentoring or from doing coaching or from celebrating victories, then I think that guy really needs to look himself in the mirror and ask why. Because otherwise he's just making excuses, and then if he makes excuses, he's just perpetuating the problem.
Sheryl Sandberg says that if you're not going to invite a woman to lunch alone anymore, then you shouldn't invite a man to lunch alone either.
Totally.
Just get to it, right?
Okay, so let's turn to your world, Brian, where these conversations we're having about quotas, I mean, sometimes when we talk about solutions to this in the finance world, it moves towards things like double bottom line investing for foundations. So, and meaning, you're managing an $11 billion endowment. Would you look at things like, screening for companies that don't adopt gender progressive, policies, or investing in funds specifically that are picking out companies that are particularly strong at this? Or do you feel that?
Well, I'm going to answer the question a little differently.
Okay.
I think that those screens can be interesting. They're part of an investment process, but there's many other pieces to it. But, my job is to get a good return. But that's not my only job, or that's not the way, I'm going to speak a little personally about this. That's not the only way that I define my job. When I got to the foundation, most of our assets were in Johnson & Johnson stock. We didn't have an investment team. So we've built one. We have 16 people, and I would hope that when I am no longer working there, people will say they did a good job building that investment team. They earned a good return, and they had an organization that had diversity of thought and diversity of behavior and really was a model for other organizations. Now, I'll pat myself on the back a little. We've had 2 people leave to become chief investment officers at other organizations. One of them, Elizabeth Hewitt, is the CIO of the Sloan Foundation, and I'm just so proud of Elizabeth. I'm proud of Rick too, but I'm really proud of Elizabeth. and you know, I think that you can accomplish these things. I mean, Me Too is in the background. I hope it's, for most people, it's not in the foreground. You can accomplish these things, but I think in particular, you've got to say, this is part of what success is, okay? The definition of success includes a number of things. Did we represent the foundation well in public? You know, if you go around acting like a jerk, even if you have good investment returns, you haven't really done your job. And what I'd like to think is that other organizations would adopt the same view of what is success. When I leave, I want to leave something behind me that has a lot of qualities that I want it to have. And diversity in the workforce is one of those.
All right, well said. So I want to go back to John actually on because you have I know, so Room to Read is a nonprofit, but you have pretty extensive business experience. And as we're having this conversation about business, I think that this is part of what comes up too, is that these are sort of, you know, addressing these types of issues may be softer. And you sort of turned your life upside down. You left Microsoft to go found this nonprofit because you saw this need, which most people are not going to do, I guess, realistically. So how do you relate to business people when you're trying to tell them the story of what you've done?
Well, I think to make it clear, when I left Microsoft, I did not have enough money to start a foundation. I had enough money to start a cash-strapped NGO and work for free for a couple of years and try to get it off the ground. And so it's been a pure bootstrap. I have to address that, because when people hear I was at Microsoft, they think, oh, you must just have started something up and started writing checks. But no, and my parents taught me that being poor is a blessing, because if you're poor, you're scrappy, right? The student born in a poor family is going to be much scrappier statistically than someone who's born to a trust fund, because you got to work for everything. And so one thing I did from the very beginning was I said, I've got to get out and tell our story to the world. I've got to convince the capitalists to get on board, because it's the capitalists who have capital. And so a lot of NGOs are like bomb-throwing socialists. They're anti-capitalist. I'm like, not at all. I am a capitalist. I'm an MBA from Kellogg, but I got to get the capitalists involved in this. So what did I do? So first of all, we said, we're going to set a bold goal. I've always believed that bold goals attract bold people. I believe that wimpy goals attract wimpy people. And the way you decide who you hang out with is how bold is the goal you set. So we said 10 million students by the year 2020, which a lot of people told us was a crazy hubristic goal. You're a cash-strapped NGO with no brand. You're going to reach 10 million students by 2020. How? And I said, I don't really know, but I'll travel around the world and I'll convince the banks and the hedge funds and the technology companies to get behind us. Number two, we pointed out the absolutely ridiculously low cost per child served. Anyone who's traveled in the developing world knows that money goes 20x, 30x, 50x as far. I was in Nepal last week, where $1 gets you 103 rupees. Money goes far. Every time we raise $50, we can bring an additional 5-year-old girl into our literacy program from a grade 1 level. $50 to change a child's life forever. We were very transparent about that, and we reported back on it, because people are suspicious. Well, if I give money to the developing world, how do I know it gets to where it gets? So we said, let's have an adopt-a-project model. You can adopt a school, $20,000, $25,000 adopts the entire thing. We put in a literacy program, a library program, teacher training, and we'll send you reports, photographs. You want to do a site visit, you can do a site visit. So we made it very, very transparent. And as a result of that, we received a lot of support from the business world, because we were very transparent, and we were reporting back to them on our metrics, and they could actually see their projects. And so Credit Suisse might have come in doing 5 libraries, and then they doubled down and doubled down and doubled down again, and Citi, Goldman, et cetera, have been behind us because we are very metrics driven. Where we ended up with that, and I'll land the airplane here, is that I'm very proud to say that we reached our 10 millionth student 5 years early. We reached our 10 millionth student in 2015. Our current trajectory is to reach at least 15 million students by 2020. And I'll just give you 2 fun facts. Number 1 is our role model is Andrew Carnegie. We wanted to do for the developing world what Carnegie did for America and Britain. He opened 2,500 libraries in his lifetime. We're now 8x Carnegie. We are 20,000 libraries and growing rapidly. Those 20,000 libraries serve 12.4 million students, 6.2 million of whom are girls and 6.2 million of whom are boys. So we're very, very proud that we have gender parity in the schools and in the libraries. Second fun fact is in our first decade, we opened libraries faster than Starbucks opened coffee shops post-IPO. Because we said if the business world knows how to scale, we need to take that same mentality to say in a world of huge numbers of illiterate people, let's not be a one-off, let's not be a Band-Aid. Final fun fact is that it's been accomplished by a leadership team that is overwhelmingly female. I was the first generation CEO, but every founder has a duty to get out of the way and appoint the second generation CEO. In this case, she was a woman. Our third generation CEO is a woman. 52% of our employees, and we have 1,500 employees worldwide, are women. 54% of our managers are women. As I mentioned, our CEO is a woman, and 5 of her 7 direct reports are women. So I often joke that a lot of companies have women in leadership initiatives and women in leadership conferences. We don't have any of that. We simply have women in leadership.
Is this for you? Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for that. So you're talking about impact, which I think is so important to measure, right? To know how we're moving along in this. Shazza, how do you think about that when you look back on what you've accomplished and where you'd like to be?
Yeah, I mean, I look at technology and entrepreneurship, which is the driver of growth in America and globally. And when I look at the statistics around 3% of women, 3% of venture capital goes to women, I think we are not funding some of the best solutions out there. So we are funding way too many dating apps, food delivery apps, laundry delivery apps, essentially, as one investor described it, apps that solve all the problems your mother used to take care of. Because entrepreneurs, when they are a homogenous group, they're solving problems for their own peers. When I invest in women and people of color, which I did not set out to build a fund that was a diversity fund or a women's fund, it just turned out as a woman and a person of color, my network had a lot of incredible women entrepreneurs and people of color that were building really interesting businesses. And they end up building companies that solve the problems that affect a much wider group of people. So our first startup, Lucy, created a platform that helps women transition back into the workforce after they have children by working with companies like eBay and other tech companies who want to retain female talent and creating customized benefits. Our second investment, Parsley, tried to integrate Western medicine with functional medicine to provide more holistic healthcare. And so we're seeing solutions that are truly important for humanity. We're seeing entrepreneurs that are far more diverse. And it's better for business and it's better for the world. So for me, in shifting the ratio in venture, shifting the ratio in entrepreneurship and technology is such a critical part of this movement.
Because you think about what we could do with that. I mean, and tell me if I'm saying the wrong statistic, but to your point about having different networks and eyes that are looking in all directions, you had mentioned a statistic, I think, that in the Middle East has more computer science graduates who are women than men.
Yeah.
And that's something in the US we talk about, how do we get women interested in this? How do we do it? Well, they're doing it, in a different way. So how can we connect those dots and figure out some of the solutions?
Absolutely.
So we're approaching the mark where we were going to open for Q&A. I think we have microphones over there. If you have a question, just raise your hand. And if you could just say quickly your name and your company or where you're from, that would be great. Over there.
Hi, David Ettinger, Bow River Capital. I think for guys like me, a lot of this gets driven home when you have a daughter. And mine's 16 months old now, and you look around, I work at a private equity firm, And we have women who work at our office, and they're like rock stars, but they're 10%. And it's just one of those gigantic tasks of, okay, how do I get my daughter from, well, she's walking now, so that was really cool, to, maybe she wants to work in private equity, or maybe she wants to do something different, but that gap. And I'm curious how you guys open up the conversation for dads, because the dads are the people who are sitting around the investment table and going to the Robert Johnson Foundation and having all of these meetings, but it's like just all the dads, it really is. And so enabling those folks to have the conversation is, I think, a big part of it, rather than just showing the cute pictures. So, tips on mentoring and showing content to girls are really helpful. Maybe one or two other tips for, dads with daughters, and especially in the investment world, when we can say, yes, your kid's really cute, but have you heard of this other thing, like showing them a Maker's movie or something like that would be really helpful.
Yeah. I think, confidence starts at the age of 5. And so I co-founded a movement called #SeeHer. If you can see her, you can be her. And media defines culture. And you can see on television today, we still don't portray girls and women in accurate and realistic ways. And so we are working on increasing by 2020. 2020 is the 100-year anniversary of women's rights to vote, an increase of 20%. You can't treasure what you can't measure. So we are holding advertisers accountable for creating better advertising. And as a result, advertisers advertise in programming. So if they insist on putting their ads in programming that also reflect girls and women in an accurate way, we will start seeing programming evolve. And I think it's just really important, even in the toy, aisles. You see T-shirts for girls that say pretty and nice, and for boys, bold, brave, fearless. We need to start creating, very different impressions for our boys and for our girls, because equality and respect for one another starts at a very young age. But it starts with you as a dad understanding that, so thank you.
And there's actually one great example in the lobby, just for if anyone who's seen the Fearless Girl statue or followed this in New York City, State Street, put a statue of a girl looking short but very defiant and courageous, and they called it Fearless Girl, and it has just kind of garnered a life of its own, people in reaction to it. So I think it's also even, and someone was telling me the other day, on Shelley's point about if you can see it, in Central Park in New York City, I think there's something like 70 or 80 statues commemorating famous men and what they've contributed to society, and there's 3 commemorating women, Alice in Wonderland. Now I'm blanking on the other, but they're basically all 3 fairy tales. So I'm sure we could think of real women that deserve a statue.
And by the way,
Just an
Fearless
idea.
Girl, they put in front of the bull.
They did, right?
And that was the whole point of it. And now the artist that created the bull is pissed off, so they're moving Fearless Girl.
Right.
Because it's in the bull's way. So, just saying.
But we have her at the conference, so. Any other questions? Yes, over here. There's a microphone. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, Peter Bryant, Development Partner Institute. Yeah, I've got 2 daughters, 17 and 11. So I've got one fact, one question. So I was interested, I was shocked when I read, the Kurds are actually more advanced than us, because every institution the Kurds have is jointly run by a man and a woman.
Huh.
It's part of their culture. It's a fact which is not well known. Second is, how do you balance this? I'm encouraging my girls to do what they want and, dream any possibility, but at the same time, you've got social media that objectifies women. Yes. And especially I see that with my 17-year-old. It's intense, and she doesn't kind of participate in it very much, I think. But you look at what's going on Instagram, which teenage girls are almost addicted to at school. It's hard to kind of reconcile those 2 worlds. And and then she tells me how boys talk at school, and the school really tries to dampen it down. There's almost this duality going on in the world, and particularly in this country, I live here, but originally from New Zealand. It's not as bad there. So how do you kind of reconcile those 2 worlds? Interested in viewpoints.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
I'm happy to take that. So I believe social media, by and large, has had some very negative consequences. However, I think it's here to stay. And so how do we use it more positively? With Malala, for example, we use social very proactively. So I would get them to follow Malala on Instagram and Twitter. But we actually just invested in a company that's creating avatars that are positive role models. So these are not real human beings. They are generated by computer and art. And their first avatar was incredibly feminist, was very passionate about Black Lives Matter, and a year in had 1 million followers. And so I think understanding that this is here to stay and becoming involved with the types of influencers and movements that are trying to channel that for good is definitely something that we need to do. The other, of course, is drawing boundaries, which is something I do in my own life, although sometimes with teenage daughters that can be unrealistic. So maybe, ushering and pushing them to follow, Malala or this activist named Lily McKellar or other activists who are using their platform for good can provide a good counterbalance. And I think more and more activism is becoming cool, and that's a shift generationally, where the next generation is more passionate about doing good than any generation before. So I think the more we can make doing good and having self-confidence and being kind cool, the less of a danger, hopefully, social media becomes.
I think there was a question right up here. And then one back there.
Hi, Melissa Stiers with George Washington University. Thank you so much. This has been excellent. I wanted to make one point. I have an 18-month-old little girl as well, so hi, new dad. And I have been talking to her. I've been saying the term, she has her little keyboard, and I say, oh, are you working on your future CEO work? Oh, are you doing CEO work? So I've been getting that into her brain. So that's how I've been talking to her. And because Shelley said she got controversial, so I did want to bring this little controversy to Nancy and Shelley and then the rest of the panel. When the article, I don't know if you all saw, came out in the Washington Post a while back when Vice President Pence said that he wouldn't take meetings with women. And I was a former chief of staff to my university president. I traveled all over the world, nighttime dinners, traveling, around the globe. I wouldn't have had my career that I had for 10 years. That article where he wouldn't take a meeting, he wouldn't go, be in the same room. I was wondering if you had a response, if you wrote a response, and what your, specifically for folks on the Hill and in Washington, what your advice is and how we can kind of change that total lack of equality there.
Yeah.
I'm hoping there's some hope.
Yeah, I would say, it's ridiculous to swing the pendulum. You don't take a wrong on one side and right it by swinging the pendulum the entire other way. So I think that was unfortunate. Again, just back to the original comment about Me Too, just act like a normal person. Don't do anything crazy. Don't touch me or take your clothing off or, just behave like a normal. It's actually not that complicated. And the comment that said that men are saying, well, I don't know, how to act, and I feel like I can't talk to women, and you're outing yourself as like a scumbag, basically. I don't think there are no men in my life that are concerned with the way they deal with women. Whether it's my father, my brother, my son, my husband, they treat women, people, with respect. It's how do you treat human beings? Do you leverage your power over them? That's really sick. It's just don't act like a jerk. Just be a good, decent human being. So I think to swing the pendulum like that is just really unfortunate. And I think we just need to, there's some bad apples in the bunch. And I feel badly if the Me Too movement demonizes all men, because it shouldn't. There's tons of awesome men out there that have never acted inappropriately with a woman, and we applaud those men and we celebrate. One of the things we do at Makers is celebrate game-changing men. We have a series called Makers Men, which celebrates men who've been very successful in their careers, but have also always championed the cause of women, brought women along, celebrated women, in actionable ways. And, the thing we don't want to do is demonize men or the relationship between men and women. We need each other. We'll never get there without both sides getting together and understanding that this is good for companies, this is good for our daughters, this is good for the country, and it's good for the world.
Yeah, Sheryl Sandberg just did a study, and it with SurveyMonkey, and it showed that 50% of men today don't want to work with women. Fact. And so
50.
50%. And so that's a really big, problem. And so I always agree with Nancy, but, I think that we have to also not assume people are bad. If someone says something or does something that you are uncomfortable with, call it out first. Pull that person aside and say, that makes me uncomfortable. Before you point a finger and say, when you say I look nice, you're sexually harassing me. Call it out and say, that bothers me, and assume people are good first. So just running away from the situation is certainly not going to get us where we need to go.
Can I just add to that and say that we're hiring, and we want to hire lots of women, and roomtoread.org has all of our available jobs. So if there's anybody out there who, like me, wants to be a corporate refugee, we're recruiting corporate refugees very actively. We don't discriminate against men, but we want to have as wide of a net as possible, and I would be remiss in my duty if I didn't mention we have about 12 job openings right now.
So I think, echoing don't act like a jerk. However, in 1952, the Boston Symphony Orchestra decided that they wanted to have more women and felt there was bias, so they got everyone to audition behind a screen so you couldn't tell their gender. And the results turned out they were still skewed male. And they then realized that when the women walked on stage, you could hear their heels. And so then they got everyone to remove their shoes. Turned out it became 50-50 male, female. So I think while do not act like a jerk is a great principle, we also have to be willing to engage in conversations around, I tried this, we put them behind a screen, it's still skewed, what do I do? And I think creating the safe space to have those conversations, to try things, to realize that some of these biases are so deeply entrenched that it takes a little while to figure out what the trigger is.
Right.
Case in point, the heels on the floor.
That's a good point. We had one more back there, yep.
Hi, my name is Heather. I'm a computational biology company founder, and I'm just, I'm so grateful for this panel and what you all have shared. And my company has the first ever test for endometriosis, which affects 1 in 10 women worldwide. It's the top cause of lost productivity. And one thing that we often see is that in medicine, physicians often don't believe women's pain until there's a man to attest to it. And just everything from how women raise venture capital to building teams, I mean, there's so much to dig into. But I think somebody mentioned that women are rewarded or they're invested in based on results rather than on kind of expectations or potential. And I think that's very true. But I think one response to that could be, well, if there's not room for us at the table, let's build our own. And so what does that mean when the folks writing the checks don't necessarily look like you or have your background? How, if you could give advice to young women out there, what does building your own table actually look like?
The entrepreneur?
Yeah, I mean, if the folks on the other side of the table don't look like you, it's harder to raise capital, because when you're raising capital early stage, your investors will tell you this. We invest in people. We have pattern recognition. So when we see people and we think they look like great entrepreneurs, we know because we've seen it before. And so it is harder. It's fundamentally harder. In fact, now some entrepreneurs who are building very successful companies, some of our investments included, turn away funds that don't have women as investment partners. I would encourage you to look at meeting funds with women partners and to explicitly ask to meet with those partners. I would encourage you to look at things like crowdfunding, both equity and cash, which are increasingly becoming tools for women to raise capital. That would be my best advice to you, and as far as you can, to bootstrap. I think very often people will raise venture capital or feel that that's the impediment to growing their business, but some of the best businesses are actually initially bootstrapped until you have the metrics where you can kind of push aside the bias and still get funded. And I'm happy to talk to you more afterwards as well.
Okay. That was very well timed because the red light just went off. So I want to thank the panel. First of all, I mean, just amazing group of people. Thank you for joining us. Thanks everyone for coming.